Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Home Video Library. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler. We are picking up in this episode where we left off in the last episode with a DVD screener to look at here. I went into detail in the last episode about what screeners are, the nature of them, what they are produced for, and so on. And there are several different possible purposes for screeners. I know I'd addressed that much earlier in the saga here, the saga of From the Star Wars Home Video Library, but since it had been a while, I figured it was time to sort of do a quick refresher on that. So if you're curious about that, look back at the previous episode. We're just going to focus on the item in question for this episode, so it is a little bit shorter. So you may recall that the home media releases of the Star Wars films tended to sort of narrow in time span for a while. You had A New Hope take 5 years for the entire film to hit home media. Then you had Empire take 4, you had Jedi take 3. Then you get to the Phantom Menace years later, and it still takes until the next calendar year. Released in '99 in theaters, hits VHS in 2000, hits DVD in 2001. In widescreen only, gets a full-screen version on DVD in 2002 alongside Attack of the Clones. So still that kind of weird gap thing going on that just narrows and narrows and narrows. If you're curious about the narrowing gap, I do cover that in a Saga on Home Video 2nd edition, addressing exactly how many days in some cases theatrical to home media took place, so you can see, which ones had the shortest times and things like that for those who are curious about minutiae like that. You can find those on Amazon, the Saga on Home Video 2nd edition. So one of the screeners we looked at very early in this series is something that now you see people at least trying to sell it for ridiculous amounts of money on eBay, on the secondary market where a lot of these screeners wind up, but which is relatively common as a screener, I would say, that you can find out there on VHS, and that is this screener for the Phantom Menace. We looked at this previously as the VHS screener. So basically, the movie comes out, this is what goes out to try to get people to vote for it for awards season. We've looked at this in detail before, like what's on it and all that kind of stuff. But this is only one type of screener, the award season screener, hey, vote for us. There are others. Fast forward to 2001, we have the very first Star Wars DVD release for a film, which is Phantom Menace here, the 2-disc widescreen edition. Every saga has a beginning, rather than saying widescreen, because they didn't have a full screen out, so there was no need to do the distinction and whatnot, as they did on Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. We've talked about that before. But this was that initial release. Little insert, and your disc with Maul on it for the film, your disc with the duel on it for the bonus features. There were bonus features, there were commentaries on the film disc here, but most of the bonus features, special features, were on that second disc. This was a big deal in terms of Star Wars. This is a big deal to some degree in terms of the DVD market in general, because the DVD market had, there were certain films that as they got released on DVD were sort of DVD player sellers. Kind of like as certain things were being released on Blu-ray, they were hoping that those could be Blu-ray system sellers, and so on here. And this was considered kind of one of those major milestones in the DVD, I want to say launch cycle, but in the DVD adoption cycle out there. Okay. 2001. Well, this was a big deal, as I said, which meant that they really probably didn't need to do a whole lot to convince video stores to carry it for sale. That was probably a bit of a given. But remember, there is another type of screener out there other than award screeners and video store, hey, please sell this in your store type screeners. There are the review screeners, which is what I believe we are looking at here today, because that's just the one that makes the most logical sense as to what this would have been created for and whom it would have been provided to. And that is this. I might be saying, don't screw with me, Butler. This is the same thing. I'm on to your tricks. No, silly fanboy. Tricks are for kids. We're all adults here. It's not a trick. You just gotta wait for the nuance. I know, bad cereal reference. Anyway, so we have Every Saga Has a Beginning, Star Wars, with the one behind it, Phantom Menace. Classic imagery there, THX stuff. Spine, oh my goodness, the spine is the same as the retail release as well. 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment, Star Wars, The Phantom Menace, 1, THX, Lucasfilm. Information on the back. The only really distinguishing feature on the back is there's a dot. Little dot over the UPC indicating this is not a for sale copy of this, but otherwise, it's the same case that we saw at retail. Yes, there are two different items I'm holding up. It's not a trick, I promise. You open this one up, there is no insert, and the discs in this case, similar case here, are quite different, at least in terms of what they look like. The content of the discs that we're going to see here are identical to the retail DVD release from 2001. Same features, language options, everything. This is basically a version of that produced to presumably send to reviewers that they couldn't just turn around and resell because it wasn't the actual retail version of it, but sent to reviewers to hype up this major milestone in DVDs and in Star Wars home media releases. Very much like the very first screener I ever received was a screener for the Legacy Revealed that History Channel sent to some fan websites, including the one that I ran at the time, so that we could do some review and sort of hype it up at the time that it was being aired on television and whatnot. In this case, sent to reviewers, presumably, to hype up this major DVD release. So here's your first disc here. Trying to get it so that it's not quite as reflective, but it's hard to do. Infinity! There we go, that's okay. So we have Star Wars The Phantom Menace Disc 1, screener, not for resale. Okay. Unauthorized use of this disc is strictly prohibited, typical for screeners. And at the bottom, you've got your property of 20th Century Fox. Typically, you will see DVDs, VHS cassettes, whatever, as screeners listed as property of. There are some legal questions as to whether that can legally be true once you have unsolicited sent it to someone, because at that point, it's a second owner, etc., etc. It's whole legal cases involving that kind of stuff. But you typically do see that language on stuff, very similar to, say, the video rental library edition of A New Hope back in '82 that had very different language on the labels rather than what you would see on the retail release later. But typically, these didn't get scooped back up by companies. Screeners usually are just kind of left out in the wild to just vanish, because as I mentioned last time, by the time they would ever hit the secondary market, typically, you know, the retail version is already out there and it's a superior viewing experience. The biggest thing they're worried about with screeners, typically, is that someone who gets one early before a home media release will use it to create a bootleg that will then be put online, for example. The language in the Revenge of the Sith screener we looked at last time, some of the language refers to not putting content from it on the internet, for example. But there's your Disc 1. Disc 2 is essentially the exact same. It says Disc 2 up at the top. But it's, again, film with commentaries, bonus features, exactly identical to these, just without the cool labels. And you'll notice no insert in the review copies. So presumably produced right around the time these are being produced, pushed out a little early, and then the retail ones hit shortly thereafter, after those who received this version, the screener version, helped hype it up online and elsewhere to hopefully drive sales. At least that is the presumed purpose of this one, given the nature of what it is. So, yeah, just kind of fun little things. Screeners are just kind of a weird little side niche of Star Wars home video collecting. A lot of folks don't bother with them. Those that do might be screener collectors. It's kind of like steelbooks to some degree. There are people who collect steelbooks and people who collect Star Wars stuff, and there is a crossover when there are Star Wars steelbooks. Kind of the same thing here. There are people who collect screeners of like everything, and there are people who collect Star Wars stuff, like me, who then wind up with Star Wars screeners in their collection just as part of that broader collecting where there is a crossover. There are some times, by the way, if you keep an eye out, not necessarily for Star Wars, but there are times you'll run into screeners for things that don't actually have a legitimate release, and it's the only way to get your hands on them. I'm a fan of the musical Rent, and there was a time when, I think it was Fox, aired a live musical version of Rent on television that never got a home media release. There's like the Broadway version you can get legitimately. There is the movie version you can get legitimately. The Fox one never got a home media release, but it was up for award consideration and did get put on a screener, unfortunately just on DVD, that you could get your hands on the secondary market out there somewhat after the fact. So screeners can be a nice avenue for stuff that doesn't exist elsewhere, but most of the time it's just a substandard way of viewing something that someone who needed it before the home media release for review or preparing for awards or whatever would have got their hands on a little bit early, that just winds up being tossed out there on the secondary market because there is a market for them, and by then the companies just don't care anymore. As long as you're not using this kind of stuff for bootlegs or something early on in the process before they can start selling stuff, generally speaking, they just get kind of tossed to the wind. It's probably more cost effective just to let them alone out there than to actually do any kind of collection process. So, yeah, just oddball little items here I want to show you. I know I've shown you other screeners before. I had forgotten that I hadn't shown you the one in the last episode, and this one for Phantom Menace just dropped into my collection just recently. It's only the second one of these that I have seen. A fellow collector, James Snow, who collects screeners as well, did happen to find one of these first, which is how I sort of knew what I was looking at when I did run across it on eBay recently. So, with that, we will wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the home video viewers, who hopefully get a chance to see the films on later retail releases that are superior to screeners, but who might collect screeners nonetheless.